Saturday, September 9th, 2023, AGNDD Intellireport topic. Dopamine. Please pardon any visual and informational inaccuracies in this entirely AI-generated Wikipedia-sourced video article.
Dopamine is a neurotransmitter that plays a crucial role in the brain and body. This text explores its chemical structure, synthesis pathways, and the factors that can affect its production. Dopamine is a catecholamine neurotransmitter that consists of a benzene ring with two hydroxyl side groups and an amine group attached via an ethyl chain. It is the simplest catecholamine and belongs to the phenethylamine family of psychoactive drugs. Dopamine is protonated in acidic environments, making it water-soluble and stable. In basic environments, it becomes less water-soluble and more reactive. Dopamine is commonly supplied as dopamine hydrochloride, a white to yellow powder for chemical and pharmaceutical use. Dopamine is synthesized in specific cell types, primarily neurons and cells in the adrenal glands. The main metabolic pathway involves the conversion of L-phenylalanine to L-tyrosine, then to L-dopa, and finally to dopamine. There are also minor pathways involving the conversion of L-phenylalanine to P-tyramine or M-tyrosine, which eventually lead to dopamine. Dopamine is synthesized in the brain and cannot cross the blood-brain barrier. It is used as a precursor for the synthesis of norepinephrine and epinephrine. Deficiencies in amino acids or cofactors can impair dopamine synthesis. Dopamine is metabolized by enzymes such as monoamine oxidase, MAO, catechol O-methyltransferase, COMT, and aldehyde dehydrogenase, ALDH. The main end product of dopamine breakdown is homovinylic acid, HVA, which is excreted in urine. Measurements of HVA in plasma have been used to estimate dopamine activity in the brain, but it can be difficult to separate HVA from other metabolites. Dopamine can also be oxidized by oxygen, producing quinones and free radicals that can damage cells and potentially contribute to conditions like Parkinson's disease. Dopamine binds to and activates cell surface receptors, including dopamine receptors and human trace amine-associated receptor 1, HITAR1. There are 5 subtypes of dopamine receptors, D1 to D5, that function as metabotropic G-protein-coupled receptors. D1-like receptors, D1 and D5, can either excite or inhibit neurons, while D2-like receptors, D2, D3, and D4, usually inhibit neurons. The effect of dopamine on a target neuron depends on the types of receptors present and the internal responses of the neuron. D1 receptors are the most abundant in the human nervous system. Dopamine functions as a neurotransmitter and neuromodulator in the brain. It is synthesized and stored in synaptic vesicles until it is released into the synaptic cleft. Dopamine binds to and activates dopamine receptors, which can be located on either the postsynaptic neuron or the presynaptic neuron. After activation, dopamine molecules are absorbed back into the presynaptic cell through reuptake mechanisms. The level of extracellular dopamine is regulated by phasic and tonic transmission, which are influenced by various factors including neuronal activity and neurotransmitter reuptake. Dopamine plays various important roles in the brain, including executive functions, motor control, motivation, arousal, reinforcement, and reward. Dopaminergic neurons are relatively few in number but have widespread projections to different brain areas. The dopaminergic areas include the substantia nigra, ventral tegmental area, posterior hypothalamus, arcuate nucleus, zona incerta, and periventricular nucleus. These areas are involved in motor function, learning, reward, motivation, aversive learning, sleep disorders, and hormone regulation. Dopamine is particularly important in the nigrostriatal and mesocortical limbic pathways, which are involved in motor control and reward, respectively. The substantia nigra and ventral tegmental area are the main sources of dopamine in the brain. They are part of the midbrain and are involved in action selection. The basal ganglia, specifically the striatum, is the largest component of the basal ganglia and receives dopaminergic projections from the substantia nigra and ventral tegmental area. Dopamine plays a role in initiating actions and setting the threshold for behavior. It also acts as a teaching signal, reinforcing behaviors that are followed by an increase in dopamine activity. In the language used to discuss the reward system, reward is the attractive and motivational property of a stimulus that induces appetitive behavior and consummatory behavior. Pleasure, learning, and approach behavior are the main functions of reward. Dopamine plays a crucial role in the reward system, functioning as a global reward signal and encoding information about the salience and value of a reward. Dopamine neurons in the ventral tegmental area and substantia nigra are activated by rewarding events and are involved in reward-related cognition. Different axonal projections from these areas have distinct functions in the reward system. Dopamine plays a central role in causing wanting and is involved in pleasure-related cognition. Pleasurable experiences such as sexual intercourse and playing video games increase dopamine release. Drugs that affect dopamine neurotransmission can lead to compulsive drug use and anhedonia. A clinical study found that dopamine neurotransmission regulates pleasure cognition in response to music. Playing video games releases dopamine in the human striatum associated with learning and behavior reinforcement. Problematic video game use is related to various psychological factors, and internet gaming disorder is recognized as a mental disorder. Dopamine does not easily cross the blood-brain barrier, so its functions in peripheral areas are largely independent of its functions in the brain. Dopamine circulates in the bloodstream, but its exact role there is unclear. Most of the dopamine in the plasma is in the form of dopamine sulfate, which is produced in the mesenteric organs and is thought to detoxify ingested dopamine. Unconjugated dopamine in the bloodstream may be produced by various organs and can act on dopamine receptors in peripheral tissues. Dopamine also plays a role in the immune system, kidneys, and pancreas. Dopamine affects immune cells, particularly lymphocytes, by reducing their activation level. It can also be synthesized and released by immune cells themselves. The exact purpose of this interaction between dopamine and the immune system is not fully understood, but it provides a potential pathway for communication between the nervous system and immune system. This connection may have implications for autoimmune disorders. The renal dopaminergic system is located in the kidney and plays a role in regulating blood pressure. Dopamine is synthesized and released by kidney cells, and it increases blood supply to the kidneys, filtration rate, and sodium excretion in urine. Dysfunction in this system can lead to reduced sodium excretion and high blood pressure. Faults in dopamine production or receptors can cause oxidative stress, edema, and hypertension. Genetic factors and high blood pressure can also affect the renal dopaminergic system. In the pancreas, dopamine plays a complex role. The exocrine part of the pancreas secretes dopamine into the small intestine, but its function there is not well understood. It may protect the intestinal mucosa and regulate gastrointestinal motility. In the endocrine part of the pancreas, dopamine receptors are found in the beta cells that produce insulin. Dopamine can reduce the release of insulin from these cells, but the source of dopamine in this context is still unclear. Dopamine is a medication used to treat low blood pressure, slow heart rate, and cardiac arrest. It is commonly given intravenously and has a short half-life. It increases sodium excretion, urine output, heart rate, and blood pressure. Dopamine acts on various receptors in the body, including dopamine receptors and adrenergic receptors. Side effects may include negative effects on kidney function and irregular heartbeats. Dopamine is also used in positron emission tomography to assess the function of the nigrostriatal pathway. The dopamine system is involved in several medical conditions such as Parkinson's disease, ADHD, Tourette syndrome, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and addiction. There are various drugs that target the dopamine system in different parts of the body. Some drugs are used for medical or recreational purposes, while others are research drugs that interact with specific dopamine receptors or affect other aspects of dopamine physiology. These include dopamine transporter inhibitors, VMAT inhibitors, and enzyme inhibitors. Multiple studies have found that there is a decrease in dopamine synthesis and dopamine receptor density in the brain as people age. This decline occurs in both the striatum and extrastriatal regions of the brain. The reduction of dopamine is believed to be responsible for various neurological symptoms that become more common with age, such as decreased arm swing and increased rigidity. Additionally, changes in dopamine levels may contribute to age-related changes in cognitive flexibility. Other neurotransmitters, including serotonin and glutamate, also show a decline in output with aging. Research has shown that an imbalance in dopamine levels can affect fatigue in individuals with multiple sclerosis, MS. In MS patients, dopamine has been found to suppress the production of certain immune cells, specifically IL-17 and IFN-gamma, by peripheral blood mononuclear cells. This suggests that dopamine may play a role in modulating immune responses and fatigue in MS. Parkinson's disease is an age-related disorder characterized by movement disorders, including stiffness, slow movement, and tremors. It is caused by the loss of cells in the brain that secrete dopamine. The primary treatment is L-DOPA, which helps offset the dopamine loss. However, prolonged use of L-DOPA can result in side effects. Additional medications that enhance dopamine function are also employed. Dopaminergic drugs can occasionally induce compulsive behaviors resembling behavioral addictions. Stimulant drugs such as cocaine and amphetamines have the ability to raise dopamine levels in the brain. This results in various effects, including heightened heart rate and improved focus. Due to their impact on the brain's reward system, these drugs can be highly addictive. Nonetheless, they can also be employed in smaller amounts for the treatment of conditions like ADHD. The dopamine system plays a vital role in addiction, and a person's susceptibility to stimulant drugs can be influenced by genetic factors. Addressing stimulant addiction poses a challenge in terms of treatment, as cravings may persist even after discontinuing drug use. In the early 1950s, psychiatrists found that typical antipsychotic medications were effective in reducing symptoms of schizophrenia. The arrival of chlorpromazine in the 1950s resulted in the discharge of numerous patients from institutions. These antipsychotics functioned by blocking D2 receptors, which led to the development of the dopamine hypothesis of schizophrenia. Nevertheless, subsequent observations have caused a decline in the popularity of the dopamine hypothesis. Psychopharmacologist Stephen M. Stahl proposed that in many cases of psychosis, including schizophrenia, interconnected networks involving dopamine, serotonin, and glutamate contribute to the excessive stimulation of dopamine receptors. Altered dopamine neurotransmission is linked to attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, which affects cognitive control and attentional, inhibitory, and working memory functions. Genetic factors involving dopamine receptors and transporters are associated with ADHD, as well as other neurotransmitter receptors and transporters. Psychostimulant drugs like methylphenidate and amphetamine, commonly used to treat ADHD, increase dopamine and norepinephrine levels in the brain. These drugs activate dopamine receptor D1 and adrenoceptor A2 in the prefrontal cortex, leading to their therapeutic effects in ADHD treatment. Dopamine is involved in pain processing in various parts of the central nervous system. Low levels of dopamine are linked to painful symptoms in Parkinson's disease. Dopaminergic abnormalities are also seen in conditions like burning mouth syndrome, fibromyalgia, and restless legs syndrome. Nausea and vomiting are influenced by the chemoreceptor trigger zone in the brainstem, which contains D2 dopamine receptors. Drugs that activate these receptors, like some Parkinson's medications, can cause nausea. However, D2 receptor antagonists like metoclopramide can be used to treat nausea. Dopamine has been found in certain bacteria and a protozoan called tetrahymena, but not in archaea. Some bacteria have enzymes similar to those used by animals to produce dopamine, suggesting a possible evolutionary link. It is hypothesized that animals acquired the ability to synthesize dopamine from bacteria through horizontal gene transfer, possibly as a result of symbiotic incorporation of bacteria into eukaryotic cells that led to the development of mitochondria. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter that has been found in the nervous systems of various animals dating back to over 500 million years ago. It is involved in modifying motor behavior and plays a role in reward learning in all animal groups. While it was previously believed that arthropods used octopamine for reward learning, recent studies have shown that dopamine also plays a part in this process in fruit flies. Additionally, the rewarding effect of octopamine is due to its activation of previously unexplored dopaminergic neurons. Many plants, including food plants like bananas, potatoes, avocados, and broccoli, contain dopamine. Dopamine in plants is synthesized from the amino acid tyrosine and can be metabolized in various ways. The functions of plant dopamine are not fully understood, but it is believed to play a role in stress response, growth promotion, and sugar metabolism. Dopamine consumed in food cannot affect the brain because it cannot cross the blood-brain barrier. However, some plants contain L-DOPA, the precursor of dopamine, which can be used as a drug. Marine green algae also contain high concentrations of dopamine, which acts as a defense against herbivores. Melanins are dark pigmented substances found in various organisms. Dopamine melanin synthesized from dopamine is a type of melanin. Human skin darkening melanin is not dopamine melanin, but there is evidence that dopamine melanin contributes to the dark color of the brain's substantia nigra. Dopamine-derived melanin may also exist in other biological systems, such as plants and butterfly wings, where it creates complex patterns and black and white stripes. Dopamine was first synthesized in 1910 and identified in the human brain in 1957. It was named dopamine because its precursor is levodopa. Its function as a neurotransmitter was recognized in 1958, and its role as a precursor of norepinephrine and epinephrine was discovered. Arvid Carlsson was awarded the Nobel Prize in 2000 for his work on dopamine. Research on adhesive polyphenolic proteins in muscles led to the discovery of polydopamine, a polymerized form of dopamine that can coat various materials when placed in a dopamine solution at slightly basic pH. Polydopamine can modulate the mechanical properties of peptide-based gels and has potential applications in protection against light damage, drug delivery, biosensors, and other biologically active macromolecules. The synthesis of polydopamine typically involves the reaction of dopamine hydrochloride with tris as a base in water. The exact structure of polydopamine is still unknown. In conclusion, dopamine is a crucial neurotransmitter that plays a vital role in various physiological processes. Its synthesis and metabolism pathways are complex, and deficiencies can have significant impacts on overall health and well-being.
Thank you for watching this AGNDD Intellireport. Like, subscribe, and click the bell button to get notified during new uploads. And make sure to tune in next time. Stay safe and healthy. Cheers.